Hello, this is Miss Smith, and I am going to be explaining reasons for English, Spanish, and French colonization. Before we get into um, the reasons for these different European countries and powers coming over to the New World to colonize, there are some different vocabulary terms that we need to go over and review. Some more, blast from the past from seventh grade: political, economic, and social. So you definitely need to know what these three words mean because you will hear them time and time again this eighth grade year. So, what do these three words mean? So, I'll give you a few moments to think about it. Go back, go back, go back, go back. Political, economic, and social. Let's see if you remember what those terms mean. First up, we have political. And if you look at the word itself, political, it has the word politic within it. Political means related to politics or government. So the pictures that I have here are directly tied to the definition. Obviously, uh, everybody knows that the presidential election of the United States is coming up in November of this year. And so, obviously, the two political parties, the Democratic and the Republican Party, that's very political. So, that's why I chose this one. And this is representing a ballot box and Americans casting their ballot for who they believe the next president of the United States should be. And this is showing you a political scene also. So, political means anything related to politics or government, could also be related to law. Economic, anything economic, if we're talking about reasons, is related to money or the economy. So obviously this picture of dollar bills, that's pretty straightforward. And this is just kind of representing like the stock market. And the last term that you need to know is social. Anything that's social, if we're talking about social reasons, would be related to people or society. So moving right along, you have the English. So coming from England, which can sometimes also be called Great Britain or Britain, which I know can be confusing for students. Sometimes they might say English or they might see British, and then they get confused about the terms being used interchangeably. They are referring to the same country. So political means, or the political reasons, I'm sorry, were that the English claimed land along the Atlantic coast. Economically, in terms of the colonization, they were looking for gold, right? We talked about the three G's, what motivated people to leave their homes, right, and take this long journey and go live in a foreign land, a land that they don't know. So they were looking for gold, right? Economic reasons, but they ended up becoming farmers. So that's how their economy was running. When we start talking about Jamestown, we'll talk about what types of crops they grew to sustain their economy. And then socially, what was their society like? And this also kind of falls under politics if we're talking about British Parliament. Parliament is like their government. Like we have Congress in America, in England, they have Parliament. But getting back to social, Parliament allowed the colonists to set up their own government, which we will definitely talk about self government when we um, get to American government and the foundations of that within the next week or two. So politically, they they staked their claim, right? That's why in the map that you guys analyzed, they had that land that hugged the Atlantic coast. That's where they landed. That's where they decided to set up their colonies. Economically, they were looking for gold, but they ultimately became farmers. And then socially, they were so far from London that Parliament said, you know what, you can create your own government. We'll let you do your own thing. Kind of out of sight, out of mind was how they felt about the colonists. So we're going to move right along to the French. Um, So the French, in terms of where they were, so you might think back to the map that we looked at that you all were analyzing, and one observation that many students made was that the size of the French territory in comparison to the the British colonies was that the French territory was much larger, and that's because the French had a greater stake and they had more claims to land, right? So they claimed land in what we now know as Canada, around the Great Lakes, and basically any land that touched the Mississippi River. So that's why all that land, including what we now know as Louisiana, but back then was known as Louisiana Territory. So all of that land was once part of um, New France, is what it was called at the time. So politically, if we're comparing England to France at that time, France was a force to be reckoned with because they had more land, which meant they had more power than England. Economically, they came to farm. They weren't looking for gold. England came because they saw something shiny and they're like, ooh, shiny, and they're chasing gold, but they ultimately had to become farmers. The French came because they wanted to work, they wanted to become farmers. They didn't become farmers like as a consolation prize or because they were forced to. They also became fur traders. So they trapped furs that they found out in the wilderness, out in the mountains, and their fur business was in conjunction with the Native Americans. Um, which I'll address their relationship with the natives once we get to the social category. So I'll put a pin in that. But they became fur traders and merchants. So economically, they did very well. Politically, they did well because they had a large claim to a lot of the land. Economically, they were doing well. And socially, they had a very strict Catholic society because I've mentioned this before. During this time period in the 16 and 1700s in Europe, like pretty much everybody is Catholic. So that is ingrained in their culture. And unlike the English or the British, they got along very well with the Native Americans, and that assisted them in their enterprise with trading furs because they worked alongside the natives. They weren't working in spite of, they're working alongside the Indians, and that's how they're able to be very successful in their business trading furs. Last but not least, you have Spanish colonization. Um, So you have politically, you have these conquistadors, and this really should be a refresher from seventh grade. The conquistadors or the explorers, they wanted to claim land, right? They wanted to control the natives. That was um, what they sought to do. In terms of economics, they wanted to conquer the land, right? That's what conquistador means. Um, and they wanted to find gold. So, like the English, the Spanish are very much driven by gold. That's what Cibola is, right? This mythical land of gold that doesn't exist. Like the the French, socially speaking, the Spaniards are also very strict Catholics as well. And in terms of what their society was like, in New Spain, the king and queen appointed or they chose specific individuals to rule within the colonies. So that explains how we arrived to this point with um, the different the different rulers and colonization. So where did we find this information? All of this information can be found on Google Classroom, and it because this is actually going to go on your chart on your European comparing English, French, and Spanish colonization chart. So this is for your own note taking, which is why I went over this, so that you can fill this in to those specific boxes on your chart, and also so you can answer that summary question. This is the chart that I'm talking about, the comparing English, French, and Spanish colonization chart. So I went over the presentation, but this shows you the different countries where you're going to follow. Obviously, here's your English, your French, and your Spanish. So those are your three columns, and these are your rows. So this breaks down the different reasons. What were their political reasons? And then, you don't necessarily have to flip back and forth right away here, but it explains what political has to do with, and it has guiding questions. Then it gets into economic reasons. It also gets into social reasons. And then your summary question is listed here. Based on what you've read and what I explained, why do you think English colonization in North America was ultimately more successful than French and Spanish colonization? It's your opinion. Why do you think? And that's after you filled out this chart up here using the presentation that I just went over with you. So that part should be pretty easy peasy.